So, next talk in the session is by Eric L. Mosnino, Latent Dimensionality Scales with the Performance of Deep Learning Models of Visual Cortex.
Hi, everyone. My name is Eric, and I'm going to be talking about how computational models with high latent dimensionality tend to be better models of visual cortex. This is a project I've been working on with my supervisor, Mick Bonner. So one of the core questions in our field is what makes for a good computational model of visual cortex? And I mean, we've all known for a while that deep neural networks make for very accurate models, but we don't yet have the perfect explanation for why. We're not at a loss for theories, though. So people have proposed that it might be due to maybe their architecture, maybe the task they're trained on, maybe the data set they're given. And all of these kinds of explanations share something in common, right? They're essentially saying that these networks succeed because their training details mimic the evolutionary and developmental constraints of some brain systems. But while these kinds of explanations are probably an important part of the picture, they do have some issues. For instance, the field is now finding that a number of different architectures in training tasks could all yield similar predictive accuracy of neural activity. And issues like these suggest that, well, maybe there's something more fundamental that we're missing, and I'll be proposing one such explanation in the framework of representational geometry. In particular, I'm going to see if we could explain the performance of these models in terms of the latent dimensionality of their representations. Okay, so let me give a brief overview of representational geometry and present a theory for how it relates to models of the brain. So any representation will be more sensitive to some stimulus dimensions than others. For instance, some neural activity might vary a lot if we change something like the animacy of a stimulus, but might vary very little if we change something like, let's say, the color saturation. And representational geometry says that high variance dimensions are accurately encoded, while low variance dimensions are noisy. This is basically always the assumption that we make when we use something like PCA and just keep the top components. Okay, so now let's imagine that we have some model and we want to compare it to the brain. One factor that will be important over here is what we might call the alignment pressure between the two representations, which basically quantifies how likely they are to prioritize the very same features. And again, this is what most theories focus on. They say that a model succeeds because something about the training results in similarities to some brain system and high alignment pressure between the two representations. But there's another factor that's been largely ignored, and that's the latent dimensionality of the model. Latent dimensionality basically refers to how many values are needed to accurately describe a representation. And one helpful way to think about it is in terms of PCA. So this model on the bottom, for instance, has higher latent dimensionality than the one on the top because more PCs are needed to account for all of its variance. And the reason that this is important for computational models is because latent dimensionality governs roughly how many features they encode, which is essentially these red of features over here with high signal. And the key here is that the more features a model encodes, the more likely it is that at least some of them will overlap with features that the brain cares about. So that's why we might expect models with high latent dimensionality on average to better predict neural activity. But this phenomenon has been largely ignored. And in fact, when theories do discuss dimensionality, they generally argue that it should be low. For instance, a recent paper by Sweeney argued that both the brain and neural networks work by learning at variances that gradually reduce dimensionality along their hierarchy. And so they would probably make the prediction that low dimensional models should actually be more similar to the brain and reach better predictive performance. So there's these really conflicting views. And in my work, we wanted to mainly investigate the question empirically and see what works best in practice. Do high dimensional models do better, or do low dimensional ones? So the basic idea to do this is very simple. We want to correlate a model's latent dimensionality with its similarity to some brain region. And that means that looking at this plot on the bottom, we just want to populate it with a bunch of models and see what the trend looks like. So to do this, well, given a deep neural network, such as a CNN, we could obtain a matrix of activations from a particular layer. And if we use a set of stimuli that were used in a neuroscience experiment, we could see how well the model activations predict actual neural activity. We do that prediction using linear encoding models, which is basically just linear regression using the model activations as regressors and actual neural activity for the targets. And then we could evaluate the performance of this encoding model through cross-validation. So this is what our neural data set looked like. It's a very popular data set that we've seen already in previous talks today. It consists of multi-unit recordings from macaques in IT. And the stimuli look just like what you see in the bottom right. It's objects pasted atop different backgrounds. All right, so that's how we measure the similarity between the model and the brain, but we also need to estimate the model's latent dimensionality. It turns out that there are many ways to do this, but we just used a very simple linear method, which involved obtaining model activations to a large number of natural stimuli and then running PCA. And then once we have those PCs, we could use this metric called effective dimensionality, which is nothing more than just a formula quantifying roughly how many PCs contribute to the total variance. So at this point, if we did it for a layer, we would have one data point for this relationship between dimensionality and encoding performance, but we need more data points to see if there's an actual relationship between these two. One way we could obtain more is by just repeating this whole process for many different layers in the network. And we could also repeat it for many different networks. So in the end, every point in the plots that I'm going to show comes from one layer in one network. And in total, we used 40 different CNNs that varied quite a bit. They had different architectures. They were given different training tasks, some supervised, some self-supervised, and they were also given different training sets. And the reason that I'm emphasizing this diversity is because if latent dimensionality really is a fundamental quantity in explaining the performance of these models, then the trend should generalize across these other factors, which are typically thought to be central in existing theories. So the theory that I outlined at the very start of the presentation says why we might expect encoding performance to increase with dimensionality. But again, this is not the consensus view in the field. Most theories that discuss representational geometry and vision work under the assumption that the brain compresses high dimensional stimuli down through a low dimensional bottleneck. So they might expect a negative correlation like this, in which models that do a better job of this compression learn more brain-like representations. And then another possibility is that there's no good relationship between these two quantities at all, and that dimensionality just isn't the best lens with which to understand these models in our context. So what do we actually see with real encoding models fit to real neural data? What we get is a strong positive trend in which models with higher latent dimensionality can reliably better predict neural activity. And I want to take a moment to emphasize how surprising this result is. When neuroscientists build computational models, they're really thinking about things like the semantics of the features or the architecture or the training task, but these results suggest something quite different. They suggest that maybe you could largely ignore those other factors, which are intuitive, and just focus on effective dimensionality, which is this really simple summary statistic of only the representational geometry. Okay, now I want to break down these results in a couple of different ways to show you just how reliable this trend is. For instance, we have models that were trained through supervised learning, self-supervised learning, and then others that were untrained. Here I'm color coding models according to those types. And what you could see is that the effective dimensionality isn't just present globally, it's also consistent within each group. So regardless of how a model was trained, or even whether it was trained at all, its effective dimensionality still reliably predicts the encoding performance it will achieve. Another thing that we could do is, because we had a large number of models with the same underlying architecture, we could look at what happens within individual layers. So this violin plot that I'm showing over here shows the distribution of correlations between effective dimensionality and encoding performance across all our layers. And in pretty much any layer you could look at, this correlation remains really high, right? This violin almost never drops below 0.5. An additional benefit of this analysis is that it lets us control for two factors in our encoding models. The first is the layer depth, and the second is the number of units in the model. It's reasonable to think that either of those could have been confounding our results, but this layer-wise analysis shows that that can't be the case, because depth and number of units is being held constant within a layer. Okay, all the results that I've shown up to this point have been on the same monkey electrophysiology data set with recordings from IT, but our results actually generalize far outside of that. So this new data that I'm showing is what we get just by repeating our whole set of analyses using a human fMRI data set with very different stimuli, where we're predicting voxels from across all of visual cortex. And even though there's really big differences in the data set, by and large, we still get the same reliable trend. The last thing that I want to do before I start to conclude is address what's probably a big elephant in the room for a lot of people, and that's the very tempting intuition that maybe all the results I've shown today are just due to some trivial statistical effects where higher dimensionality and additional features always leads to better regression performance, right? Very intuitive. And this is something that bothered us at the start because it's an intuition that's actually true on the training set, but due to overfitting, right? Additional features will only improve performance in the validation set if they provide additional information about the targets. And all the encoding scores I've shown today have been measured through cross-validation. So it really is the case that our high dimensional models are better in a very meaningful sense. Okay, unfortunately, those are all the results that I have time to show today, although we do have a lot more and a paper is coming out soon, but let me just try and summarize what I've said. So our main finding is that encoding performance scales with the latent dimensionality of a model, and we outlined a theory for why that might be. And this is pretty surprising given that most theories discussing representational geometry and vision actually argue for low dimensional representations. Zooming out a bit, our results might have big implications for the field. So it's possible that latent dimensionality is what's playing a fundamental role in encoding performance, and that other factors such as a training task or architecture primarily act through their effects on dimensionality. And then there are also a bunch of interesting follow-up questions. So an obvious one is that I've been talking about the dimensionality of models of visual cortex here, but we still haven't directly measured the dimensionality of visual cortex itself. Although we do have some ideas for how to go about doing this, and my amazing lab mate Raj is working on that project. He could tell you all about it. Another really interesting direction is to think about the computational benefits of high dimensional representations, which I wasn't able to focus on at all in this talk. But there's this interesting perspective emerging that says high dimensional representations, because they provide an expressive basis set of features, are essential when solving a diverse array of tasks that aren't known a priori, but emerge over the course of an agent's lifetime. And a recent paper by Sorscher actually looked at something similar in the context of object classification. They provided theoretical reasons for why high dimensional representations should be better at classifying novel object categories they weren't initially trained on. And one of the results that I didn't have time to show today is that we actually verified this empirically in our models and found it to be true. So there's a lot of really exciting ideas about the computational benefits of high dimensional representations. This is something that my group wants to continue looking at. And yeah, we've only begun to scratch the surface. But with that, I'd like to thank my supervisor, Mick, my whole lab for useful discussions, and thanks a lot for sticking around until the very last session.
Time for questions.
Great talk, pretty interesting. So I think you made a really compelling case for like sufficiency, right? Like saying like, okay, it looks like these are really like sufficient for explaining this, but it wasn't really necessarily a very strong case for necessity. So what I was wondering is, so you're showing these nice correlations. Have you actually tried something like adding a bottleneck layer, seeing if you can actually compress these into like a lower dimensional space and seeing if like you would still actually get like for these different networks, you still get these kind of trends?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So definitely doing this encoding performance is a question about like sufficiency, right? In fact, in this plot over here, you can see like a bunch of points in the top left of lower dimensional models that are actually doing a pretty good job. So something like RSA, which we haven't looked at with this class of models, might illuminate if all the features in these high dimensional models are necessary as well. Although I'm skeptical that the RSA kind of analysis on our current neural data sets could be too informative, because one issue with the current neural data sets is that they only span a very small subset of what the brain probably cares about. The effective dimensionality of our neural data set that we're using actually is like around 6, for instance, over here. And the high dimensional models are doing much better. So I think that, yeah, in addition to RSA, obtaining a neural data set that tries to maximize for dimensionality will really be important here. Yeah, thanks.
One way to increase the dimensionality of the effective dimensionality of your model is to take all 40 neural networks and put them in a big bag and then do the regression on that. So, right, so that would give you the highest encoding score.
Yeah.
According to your perspective.
Yeah, that would be interesting, and I'm not sure if that would give the highest encoding score.
Well, why wouldn't it?
Well, one possibility is that the high dimensional models are kind of like a superset of the dimensions of the low dimensional ones, right? So in that case, you wouldn't really be adding anything additional. In fact, you'd be adding like features with covariance that would lead to more overfitting.
Right. So, right. So if you didn't have enough data or the right regularization, in that case, you wouldn't get an improvement in encoding score.
Right, exactly. And we're actually not using regularization in any of these models here.
Okay. More to come. Cool talk. Thanks.
Thanks.